So, let's talk about Mr. Greg. This is Steven Universe Universe. You like? Before we get this analysis started, I'm going to present you with two facts. Fact number one, I loved this episode. From top to bottom, it's just a wonderful romp that both captures the essential textures of the show, its humor, and its dramas, as well as pays homage to the conventions and trappings of classic Hollywood musicals. From a cinematographic point of view, it is an example of compositional excellence. Almost every major beat is framed in such a way to effectively carry the emotional and narrative subtext in a single image. No expression is squandered, no moment of import unaccentuated. And the music which fills this episode is some of the best in the series so far. Fact number two, as a general rule, I hate musicals. This is going to get pretty ranty, so bear with me. I promise, it's for a purpose. In its theatrical form, musicals attempt to blend the musicality of opera with the narrative complexity of plays, rarely doing so, in my opinion, with any level of efficacy, with the two parts either pulling against each other like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or bashing heads like the Capulets and the Montagues. In its cinematic form, they're holdovers from the era when the film industry was only just beginning, when they would literally just stick a camera in the audience section of live performances and just roll film. It was when film as a medium didn't yet understand what it was, and that it was its own medium and didn't have to go by the rules of older, more established forms of entertainment. That it was more than just a delivery mechanism. Musical films simply attempt the same sort of melding theatrical musicals try, but are even harder to do well because film and theater have so many techniques and conventions that are in complete opposition of each other. Theatrical acting is big and expressive, but by necessity, because the people at the back of the house need to be able to see it. Film, however, has no such constraint. It can get right into the action and capture the finer, more nuanced, more natural performances with perfect clarity. Is it impossible to have a musical film with subtle acting? Well, no, of course not. The Sound of Music is a prime example. But then they understood when to use the conventions of musicals and when to use the conventions of film, which most don't. Even then, it's clear when they are using which. The framing for most of the Dance of the Landler has a clear stage left, stage right, and plaster line where the cameras don't cross until about 2/3 of the way through, when they want to show the growing tension between Maria and Captain Von Trapp and their discovery by the Baroness. Compare this to the scene in Shall We Dance when John is first learning to waltz. The camera moves, not as if the characters are on a stage, but like they're in a real room. There are 4 walls. And this, in part, is why I love this episode so much. Alright, we'll get back to musicals in a minute, but we do need to talk about what this episode said as opposed to, just how it said it. The primary conflict in this episode comes from 2 places. Pearl's ongoing resentment towards Greg for getting between her and Rose, and Greg's failed attempts to smooth out his relationship with Pearl, the tone of which was established basically since the day they met. When Greg suggests that he and Steven take a trip to Empire City, Steven guilts Pearl into coming and Greg into not objecting by invoking Rose's name, in what would otherwise be the world's creepiest coping mechanism if we didn't know it was 100% intentional. Once they're in Empire City, Greg treats everyone to the finer things in life, and they all start having fun. Even Pearl. Greg, however, pushes it a little too far by trying to get Pearl to dance with him. Fusion, which is incredibly contingent on trust, seems to have dancing as almost a requisite step. So naturally, she recoiled and withdrew. Later, Pearl has a moment on the balcony where she shadow boxes with Greg in an imaginary conversation with him about their mutual pursuit of Rose, how she chose him, and Pearl's struggle with her own inability to move on. The whole refrain of the song, "It's over, isn't it? Isn't it? Isn't it over?" is both an intellectual acknowledgement that her competition with Greg is and has been over for a long time, in spite of how she feels, as well as her howling at the moon, asking why hasn't she been able to deal with these feelings yet and when that struggle will end. Why, essentially, she can't emotionally process Rose picking Greg over her after all this time. Things get rough, however, when Pearl finds out Greg overheard the whole thing. Greg gives up and walks out, but Pearl tries to stop him, though he fails. She does want to reconcile with him, but her feelings often make her act hostile towards Greg in spite of herself. Steven drags her down to the ballroom/banquet hall where Greg is sitting eating one maraschino cherry after another. He wants them to talk, but the tension is so thick you could cut it with a knife. So Steven sings a song to get them talking to each other, using their mutual love of him to give them common ground. And it all more or less comes out. Pearl says she doesn't hate Greg as he fears, and that her problem was that ultimately Rose fell in love with him rather than her. And yeah, they dance. More than that, Pearl initiates it. And so we leave the city and Pearl and Greg's animosity along with it. As the episode closes, Steven repeats the refrain one more time, but only partially. Because after all this time, it's over, isn't it? And this is the part where I essentially copy and paste a paragraph from the script of last episode. Actually, you know what? Let's just copy and paste that footage, save us some time. Let's see how that works out. However touching this was, it probably doesn't mean everything will be hunky-dory between the two of them. It's going to take time. One act of support or understanding can't make up for years of animosity. Or maybe it can. The Joker in the DC universe was always an example of how one bad day is able to drive a person over the edge, but is there any reason why it can't work the other way around? One good day, one positive act being able to turn a long term of conflict into a happy relationship? I have hope for these two. Huh. That worked surprisingly well. Alright, well, time to pick up where we left off about 4 minutes ago. The camera moves, not as if the characters are on stage, but like they're in a real room. There are 4 walls. And this, in part, is why I love this episode so much. Rather than using the conventions of theater, restricting the viewing angles to what could be expected if the performance was taking place on a proscenium stage, it uses the conventions of film instead. The movement and positioning of the camera isn't defined by the space, but by the characters and actions in the space. To show you what I mean, let's look at a couple of examples. Let's start with the song Mr. Greg and look at some of the shots in it. Specifically, let's look at the framing and the apparent distances between characters. Look at how close everyone is. Close, 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 close. Whoa, what happened here? Look at how far away Pearl is from Steven and Greg. They're miles apart. And then this shot makes it worse. The distance between them combined with the openness of the space just makes the distance feel even bigger. The sudden shift from short, close shots to these lingering, long shots is jarring. And that's the point. It's using the language of film to establish a tone, then show you and make you feel the shift in the emotional tone through the camera work. Now let's look at It's Over, Isn't It? And although I could say something about nearly every shot in this song, I actually want to talk about all of them all at once. Every shot moves and is framed to reflect the action. When Pearl is making small movements, the camera comes in. When she's making big movements, the camera backs off. When she's making isolated movements, the camera focuses on that one part of her. And when she's barely moving at all, the camera moves for her. Why? because this song and Pearl's performance are emotionally dynamic, and the power to magnify or diminish that dynamism is in the positioning and framing of the camera. Don't believe me? Picture how that whole scene would have looked from only one angle, 50 feet away. That singular distant vantage point is what you would get in a theater. And there is the power of using the conventions of film with a music-driven performance rather than the conventions of theater in a filmic medium. So why am I spending so much time looking at stuff like composition and the pros and cons of the style of musical film? Well, because if you really think about what happened in the episode, there isn't much to say regarding the plot. But how could that be? For Drop Beat Dad, just about the total running time of the episode is spent discussing the episode. And I'm at about the same point now, but only about a third of the total running time thus far was spent talking about the plot? What? Well, it's because one of the common issues with musicals is just how little development happens during a song. Musical numbers by nature have to stretch out a singular idea to fit the conventions of musical structure. Stylistically, they are amazing, but they are anything but efficient when it comes to plot development per unit time. Compare the amount of development in this episode to one like Jailbreak. Same amount of time, but loads more development in it. 1776, my favorite musical and quite possibly the only movie I can quote nearly line for line, is 3 hours long, and that's covering one sequence of events. This episode of Steven Universe was fantastic because it executed the artistic side of, being a musical while not trying to tackle more than one goal. That goal being to smooth things over a bit between Greg and Pearl. But I like episodes with a lot of developmental meat on it, so I hope they don't put episodes like this out too often. But that's that. Now it's time for us to look at the little crumbs of lore, jokes, and inconsistencies sprinkled through the episode. You guessed it, it's time for the bits. One wall of Greg's van and the floor is wood. Tidy-whities, I'm pretty sure this shot is physically impossible. Greg's looking at Pearl like, "How you doing?" And she's having none of it. This is not a whip pan. This look says they agree Steven needs some therapy. Every member of the staff looks exactly the same. Guess generic service workers in the world of Steven Universe operate by Officer Jenny rules. Except Curly Q McJudgyface over here, though I'm pretty sure that's him at the seafood restaurant in Fusion Cuisine. Greg cleans up pretty nicely, but damn, Pearl in a tux? Meow. I have to say, I kind of fell in love with this penthouse. Though that is one exceptionally empty bar for a penthouse suite. Steven left his game of Golf Quest mini running. Guess he couldn't save mid-fight with the windmill boss. Follow the trail of detritus and it will leave you right to Steven and Greg. I didn't understand the waifu thing until this exact moment. I swooned. Ay, Dios mío. Steady, Victor, steady. So, Pearl can control clouds? I mean, I know we saw this to some effect in Sworn to the Sword, but I thought it was like a battlefield effect, like the floor saws in BattleBots. What must this look like to people on the ground who are just randomly looking up? I bet some meteorologist must be thinking he's losing his goddamn mind. This Cherry Man thing keeps coming up. What does it mean? This pianist can't read a room to save his life, but he did just make his salary for the entire week, so... Greg and Pearl are opposite colors in this sequence. Also, they are the same colors of Jasper and Lapis. Make of that what you will. Now, kid. Greg's not kidding when he says those cost something. A night at a penthouse suite in New York can cost you upwards of $40,000, and tailor-made suits $3,000 and up each. Adding that to an estimation of all the other expenses, including the stuff they broke, he could have easily spent $60,000 in one night. No small pennies for a guy who until recently was struggling to meet ends meet running a car wash. So that's it for this episode. Catch us next time when we talk about Too Short to Ride. In the meantime, click here to watch the latest episode of Friday Night Party Line, here to hear what I have to say about Drop Beat Dad, or over here to watch the very first episode of Acceptable Vices, where we played a game of my own creation, Quest to Castle Ronchausen. In the meantime, I've been Victor Frost, and I'll see you next time on Steven Universe Universe.
The chair now declares this Congress a committee of the whole for the purpose of debating Virginia's resolution on independence. Mr. Dickinson.
Well now, Mr. Adams, you've gotten your way at last. The matter may now be discussed. I confess I'm almost relieved. There's a question I've been fairly itching to ask you. Why?
Why what, Mr. Dickinson?
Why independence, Mr. Adams?
Well, for the obvious reason that our continued association with Great Britain has grown intolerable.
To whom, Mr. Adams? To you? Oh, then I suggest you sever your ties immediately. But please, be kind enough to leave the rest of us where we are. Personally, I have no objections at all to being part of the greatest empire on earth, to enjoying its protections and sharing its benefits.
What benefits? Crippling taxes, cruel repressions, abolished rights?
Is that all England means to you, sir? Is that all the affection and pride you can muster for the nation that bore you? For the noblest, most civilized nation on the face of this planet? Or would you have us forsake Hastings and Magna Carta, Strongbow and Lionheart, Drake and Marlborough, Tudors, Stuarts and Plantagenets? For what, sir? Well, tell me, for what? For you? Some men are patriots like General Washington, and some are anarchists like Mr. Paine. Some even are internationalists like Dr. Franklin, but you, sir, you are merely an agitator, disturbing the peace, creating disorder, endangering public welfare, and for what? Your petty little personal complaints, your taxes are too high. Well, sir, so are mine. Come, Mr. Adams, if you have grievances, and I'm sure you have, our present system must find a gentler means for redressing them short of revolution. That's what he wants. Nothing short of it will satisfy him. Violence, rebellion, treason! Now, Mr. Adams, are these the acts of an Englishman?